Sen was a 20-year-old young woman, the eldest child in a poor family. From a young age, she had to work hard to support her family, with little opportunity for play or education. Her father had fallen ill and passed away, leaving her mother to struggle to raise 4 younger siblings. When Mrs. Ka, a wealthy but stingy 65-year-old woman, took Sen in as a maid to help repay her family's debt, Sen's life became even more arduous. Mrs. K was a very wealthy but frugal woman, living in a large 3-story house with a vast garden of grapefruit trees heavy with fruit. Her husband, also 65, spent most of his days working outside to make money, rarely at home. Despite her wealth, Mrs. K was extremely thrifty, hoarding every penny. Yet, all the household chores, from cleaning the 3 floors of the house, sweeping the garden, shopping, cooking, to tending the grapefruit trees to harvest and sell, were Sen's responsibility. Each night, after everyone else in the household had gone to bed, Sen would massage Mrs. K's hands and feet to help her relax. Sen was gentle, compliant, and seldom complained. She had the weathered appearance of a peasant laborer, with a plain and sincere face, but there was a quiet strength in her eyes, a yearning to be loved, and a simple hope for a better life. Despite working tirelessly day and night, Mrs. K never appreciated Sen's efforts. To her, Sen was simply a debtor, someone who had to pay off her family's obligations. A young man named Tan, 25, who lived in Sen's village and was an ordinary but kind-hearted man, had loved Sen for a long time. They had gotten to know each other during Sen's most challenging days. They would have brief conversations, and sometimes, in the fleeting moments Sen could spare, they would share a few words. Eventually, Tan approached Sen's mother to ask for her hand in marriage. Her mother agreed, but when Mrs. K heard the news, she was astonished. She allowed the newlyweds to live in a small hut in the grapefruit garden behind her house. Each day, Sen's husband worked as a hired laborer in the fields recently purchased by Mrs. K's husband. Tan always encouraged Sen, promising her that he would care for her and give her a better life. One day, after some time, Sen discovered she was pregnant. When Mrs. Ka learned of Sen's pregnancy, she didn't express joy. Instead, she felt irritation and jealousy. Mrs. K had longed for a child herself, but had been unable to conceive despite seeking treatments and praying at temples. She desperately wanted a child, but now there was only bitterness and envy in her heart towards Sen. Each time she saw Sen's growing belly, a pang of sadness and pain struck her heart. Mrs. K pretended to show concern for Sen, especially as her pregnancy progressed. Yet, beneath her caring gestures lay hidden motives. She would quietly observe Sen's every move, asking questions about her pregnancy, but there was a glint of envy in her eyes that she couldn't hide. One day, while Sen was cleaning the house, Mrs. K approached and stared at her growing belly. In a soft, longing voice, she asked,
Sen, how much longer until your due date? You seem tired.
Sen looked at Mrs. K and replied hesitantly,
Thank you, Mom, but I'm still feeling well. It's just been tiring work. I'm due in about 5 months.
Mrs. K smiled, but her heart was filled with mixed emotions. She wished she could feel the warmth of a child in her womb as Sen did, yearned to hold a baby in her arms, to hear its cries, and to care for it with all her love. But such a thing was forever out of reach for her. On the day Sen's child was born, Mrs. K went to the small hut to visit. She gazed at the newborn with eyes filled with a glimmer of hope, but also deep regret. Sen held her baby in her arms, her face glowing with happiness despite her physical exhaustion. Mrs. K uttered a short but heartfelt phrase.
"What a healthy little boy."
Sen smiled, her eyes sparkling, though filled with concern for the future. She knew her life would never be easy, but at least she now had her child, a gift that so many women dreamed of. In the end, Mrs. K gave Sen a small sum of money to buy clothes for the baby. The absence of a child in her own life made her heart ache for herself, and with all her wealth, she wondered who it would go to one day. She knew her dream could never come true, while Sen, no matter how challenging life might be, would rise to achieve her hopes. Sen was determined to live for herself, her family, and her child. Mrs. K might have all the material wealth in the world, but the love and warmth of a child, the sound of a baby crying or seeking comfort from its mother, were things she would never have. Vocabulary words with definitions from the story The Child. 1. Eldest, the oldest among a group, especially in a family. Example: Sen was the eldest child in her family. 2. Arduous, involving or requiring strenuous effort, difficult and tiring. Example: Sen's life became even more arduous when she worked as Mrs. Ka's maid. 3. Frugal, economical in use or expenditure, sparing or saving. Example: Mrs. K was a wealthy but extremely frugal woman. 4. Vast, very large in extent, size, or amount. Example: Mrs. Ka's house had a vast garden filled with grapefruit trees. 5. Hoarding, accumulating, and storing away money or valuables. Example: despite her wealth, Mrs. K was always hoarding her money. 6. Weathered, worn by long exposure to the weather or hardship, showing signs of age or toil. Example: Sen had a weathered appearance from years of hard work. 7. Sincere, free from pretense or deceit, genuine. Example: Sen had a plain and sincere face that reflected her honesty. 8. Fleeting, lasting for a very short time. Example: Sen and Tan shared fleeting moments of conversation during her busy days. 9. Pregnant, carrying an unborn child within the womb. Example: Sen discovered she was pregnant and felt a mix of joy and concern. 10. Irritation, the state of feeling annoyed or angry. Example: Mrs. K felt irritation and jealousy when she saw Sen's growing belly. 11. Jealousy, a feeling of envy towards someone else's achievements or possessions. Example: Mrs. Ka's jealousy stemmed from her inability to have a child. 12. Conceive, to become pregnant or to form an idea or plan. Example: despite many attempts, Mrs. K had never been able to conceive a child. 13. Bitterness, a feeling of deep anger or resentment. Example: Mrs. Ka's bitterness toward Sen grew with each passing day. 14. Motive or reason for doing something, especially one that is hidden or not obvious. Example: Mrs. Ka's kind gestures toward Sen had hidden motives. 15. Exhaustion, a state of extreme physical or mental tiredness. Example: Seen held her baby in her arms, glowing with happiness despite her exhaustion. Phrases with definitions and examples. 1. From a young age, starting early in life. Example: From a young age, Sen had to work hard to support her family. 2. Little opportunity for having few chances or possibilities for something. Example: She had little opportunity for play or education due to her responsibilities. 3. Tirelessly day and night, working continuously without showing signs of fatigue. Example: Despite working tirelessly day and night, Mrs. K never appreciated Sen's efforts. 4. Mixed emotions, feelings that are both positive and negative at the same time. Example: Mrs. K smiled, but her heart was filled with mixed emotions. 5. Out of reach, unattainable, or impossible to achieve. Example: The joy of holding a child was forever out of reach for Mrs. K. 6. Glowing with happiness, radiating joy and contentment. Example: Seen held her baby in her arms, her face glowing with happiness despite her physical exhaustion. 7. Sparkling with concern, showing worry or care through one's expression. Example: Seen smiled, her eyes sparkling, though filled with concern for the future. 8. Rise to achieve, to overcome obstacles and accomplish something important. Example: Sen, no matter how challenging life might be, would rise to achieve her hopes. 9. Material wealth, tangible possessions, and financial assets, as opposed to emotional or spiritual richness. Example: Mrs. K might have all the material wealth in the world, but she lacked the love of a child. 10. Longing voice, a tone that expresses a deep desire or yearning for something. Example: In a soft, longing voice, Mrs. K asks Sen about her due date.